As the Prime Minister has said, the coronavirus pandemic is the worst public health crisis for a generation. It is unsettling for families up and down the country and in all of our constituencies. So we need a united effort to tackle COVID-19 effectively and to come through this challenge, as I'm confident that we can and will. Following on from and consistent with the domestic measures announced by the Prime Minister yesterday, and based on the fast-changing international circumstances, today I'm announcing changes to FCO travel advice. Mr. Speaker, UK travellers abroad now face widespread international border restrictions and lockdowns in various countries. The FCO will always consider the safety and the security of British nationals. So with immediate effect, I've taken the decision to advise British nationals against non-essential travel globally for an initial period of 30 days and, of course, subject to ongoing review. Now, Mr. Speaker, I should emphasise this decision has been taken based on the domestic measures introduced here in the UK, alongside the changes to border and a range of other restrictions which are now being taken by countries right around the world. The speed and the range of those measures across other countries is unprecedented. Some of those decisions are being made without notice. In some countries, even in countries or particular areas where there haven't yet been any reported cases of COVID-19, local authorities are nonetheless imposing restrictions on movement, and again doing so with little or sometimes no notice whatsoever. In light of those circumstances, we want to reduce the risk of leaving vulnerable British tourists or travellers stranded overseas. We will, of course, keep this advice under review and amend it as soon as the situation responsibly allows. Now, the government, of course, is keenly aware that international freight services, such as shipping and haulage, are vital for ensuring the continuity of the supply of essential food, goods and material to the UK. So we do regard this kind of travel as essential, and we will work with industry to issue detailed advice which maintains the flow of goods whilst protecting the well-being of staff who are working on those routes. The Department for Transport will be leading this work with the freight sector with the objective of minimising disruption to those routes as far as is possible. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, FCO consular teams are working round the clock to provide the best and the most up-to-date information that we can possibly provide to UK nationals. Just by way of context, in the last week alone, we have made over 430 changes to FCO travel advice, and we will obviously continue to keep it under close and constant review. We're providing support to British nationals who have been impacted by coronavirus while travelling. During the initial outbreak or containment phase, we arranged the repatriation of more than 200 vulnerable British nationals from China between the 31st of January and the 9th of February. And we took that particular action, Mr. Speaker, to support British nationals and control the return of those possibly exposed to COVID-19 at the earliest point in the crisis, when it appeared that the virus might be contained in China. In other cases, like the British nationals affected by COVID-19 infection in the hotel in Tenerife, we worked with travel companies and airlines to ensure that those concerned were safely brought home. Mr. Speaker, we also changed our travel advice to advise people over 70 or with underlying health conditions against travelling on cruises to protect the most at risk from coronavirus. And we have arranged repatriation from cruise ships, including most recently 131 UK nationals who returned from the Grand Princess, which was docked in California, and they arrived home last Wednesday. On the issue of cruises, we've been working intensively with the Cuban authorities and Fred Olsen Cruise Lines to ensure that all of the British nationals are able to return quickly and safely to the UK. In relation to, that's of course the Bremer cruise liner. We're doing all we can to ensure that they return to the UK on flights from the Jose Marti International Airport in Havana within the next 48 hours. Spoke to the Cuban Foreign Minister twice over the weekend, and we are very grateful to the Cuban government for swiftly enabling this operation and for their close cooperation to make sure it could be successful. As well as those repatriations, UK consular teams are working with those who are affected by difficult quarantine conditions, the closure of tourist resorts, for example, in Europe and North Africa, or indeed just when there are new regulations that are introduced in countries where British nationals are visiting. We will do everything in our power to get those British nationals affected the care, the support, and the practical advice that they need. Mr. Speaker, we also need to be clear about our capacity to repatriate people from abroad, given the scale of the numbers. We have taken action where necessary, but no one should be under any illusions. It is costly, it is complicated to coordinate, so government-supported repatriations have only been undertaken in exceptional circumstances. Ultimately, the primary responsibility for managing outbreaks of COVID-19 and quarantine measures must rest with the country in which the outbreak has occurred. FCO teams around the world are working urgently to ensure that governments have sensible plans to enable the return of British and other travellers, and crucially, to keep borders open for a sufficient period to enable returns to take place on commercial flights wherever that's possible. Following today's change in travel advice, British nationals who decide that they still need to travel abroad should do so fully aware of the increased risks of doing so. And that obviously includes the risk that they may not be able to get home if travel restrictions are subsequently put in place that they hadn't anticipated. So we urge anyone still considering travel to be realistic about the level of disruption they are willing and able to endure, and to make decisions in light of the unprecedented conditions that we face. Mr. Speaker, today's travel guidance follows the domestic measures announced yesterday. It forms part of our national effort to meet the international challenge presented by coronavirus, a challenge we will rise to as a government, as a country, and I commend this statement to the House.
Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. We hear what he says on freight, but could he give us any guidance on what is essential travel when it comes to people? Does it include people coming home? This is a time of immense concern for tens of thousands of British nationals stranded abroad, not just dealing with the stress of trying to get accurate information and make their way home, but doing so facing the ever-present fear of infection. I was contacted yesterday by Tom, one of the 65 British nationals in Cusco, Peru, and which has announced a 15-day state of emergency with its borders closed and the army enforcing a quarantine. Tom's flight to Britain today has been cancelled, and his calls to our embassy in Lima have not been answered. And why is that? Because the embassy itself has decided to close down for 15 days just when its services were needed most. The Secretary of State said in his statement that our consular teams are working around the clock to provide the best information available to UK nationals. Well, I'm afraid that simply isn't the case in Tom's experience. We have received no advice or assistance, he says. We are all extremely concerned at being stranded here. Across the world, there are tens of thousands of British nationals in the same position as Thomas, and all with the same message for the British government: help bring us home. As far as we're concerned, our travel is essential. And it is no use telling them to rely on advice from the governments in the countries that they are travelling, when our tourists will inevitably be the least of those countries' concerns. Nor is it any use telling them to rely on the instructions of their travel operators, which have all too often in recent weeks been at odds with the official FCO travel advice and driven by the fear of insurance claims and bankruptcy, not by the needs of our citizens. The government cannot keep passing the buck to others, especially when it comes to repatriation. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's expensive. But that is the nature of the crisis that we face. So I asked the Secretary of State in his response directly to address Tom and his compatriots in Peru and all other British nationals around the world currently in the same position and tell them what he is doing to help bring them home. Can I ask the Secretary of State to reassure us today that the Foreign Office will learn the lessons from this fiasco by asking itself some very basic questions? First, why were there no clear protocols already in place on the plans for evacuation and repatriation in the event of an outbreak such as this? And if those protocols were in place, why were they not followed? Second, why has official travel advice from the FCO been so slow to match what is happening on the ground, to the extent that this weekend we had tour operators going door to door in French ski resorts telling British families to leave immediately, whilst the Foreign Office website said that there were no restrictions on travel? And third, most basically, as Tom's case in Peru illustrates, will the Foreign Secretary determine why the levels of consular support had been so out of step with the levels of global demand? Mr. Speaker, when the dust settles on this crisis, as we all hope it eventually will, we will reflect on what has been a chronic failure of global leadership and coordination in which our own government has sadly been one of the parties. Instead of every country working together to agree best practice and apply common standards on testing, tracking and travel restrictions, on quarantines, self-isolation and social distancing, we have instead seen a global free-for-all when every country has been going it alone. And instead of the international community coming together to pool its experience and work together to develop a vaccine and a cure, we have again seen individual companies and countries working in silos. And the shameful attempt by Donald Trump to buy the German company in the lead when it comes to discovering a vaccine, not just to steal the glory of the vaccine for himself, but to hoard it for the Americans alone. Mr. Speaker, the challenges posed by coronavirus are fearful enough for the world without our leaders compounding them through their incompetence or their inaction. We have seen exactly that when it comes to this government's approach to repatriation, but it is part of a pattern which goes far beyond that one issue and far beyond our one country. So in closing, will the Secretary of State undertake today that as well as fixing the immediate issues we face with the coronavirus, not least around repatriations, but that Britain will also lead the way in ensuring that these outbreaks are better managed in future?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her response, at least in relation to recognising the scale of the challenge. She asked a number of questions, and I'll try and give her as much of a substantive response as I can. She asked about what essential or non-essential travel means. Ultimately, the way travel advice is given by the Foreign Office is that the decision on whether to travel is nonetheless remains an individual decision. Travellers may have urgent, particularly exceptional business, family or commercial or otherwise, and circumstance may differ. But what we are doing is strongly advising against travel globally, and that's partly a reflection of the measures domestically that were announced yesterday around social distancing, but also because we want to limit the number of people, particularly vulnerable people, that find themselves in the plight of not being able to get home because of some of the issues that she's raised. She mentioned the team in the, I think it was the Philippines, in Peru. And the team is working as best it can under very difficult conditions. I'm very happy to take away and look at the case that she's referred to. We have a whole range of practical advice for MPs, honourable members of this House, to give advice to their constituents. Our FCO travel advice is obviously available online. You can, honourable members and indeed their constituents can sign up to receive email updates so they get it in real time. And my officials also run a specific hotline for honourable members to contact. I've also shared details with honourable members in a Dear Colleague letter, which will go out shortly today. So we're doing everything we can to give honourable members on all sides the practical information that they need in what is obviously a very fast-moving and fluid situation. The Honourable Lady asked what we're doing more generally in relation to helping people to get back home. The first thing to say is to avoid travel where you might find yourself in a situation, either because of current measures or future measures, that you're unable to get back home. We are also liaising with the tour operators and the airlines to make sure that even when restrictions are in place, that there is a window of opportunity to get out with commercial flights. Given the volume, we don't have precise numbers, but the volume of people, British nationals who are abroad, not permanently, not living abroad necessarily, but travelling abroad, to expect that the government can repatriate them all, I think would be unrealistic. What we do is make sure that we're in a position to protect the most vulnerable. She asked why our consular teams are stretched. I have to say to the Honourable Lady, she ought to have a look at the scale of the international challenge this country and everyone is facing with COVID-19. And The teams across government, but including the consular teams in the Foreign Office, doing an exceptional job in very difficult circumstances. The Honourable Lady is right to point to different measures that have been taken around the world. The UK approach is to follow the best scientific advice that we've got, and also to deal with and take measures, both domestic measures and international measures, in line with trying to reduce the peak of the coronavirus in the UK, the number of infections, and also make sure we maximise the capacity of the NHS to deal with it. Finally, she did her usual routine of sniping at the US president. I have to say, that is no substitute for a serious question on the substance, let alone a serious policy answer.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
As the Honorary President of the British International Freight Association, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his words about the freight forwarders and their job in keeping goods moving in and out of the country. Can I raise two other brief issues with him? One is, can he encourage both the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the tour operators and airlines to have easily accessible websites so that tourists who may be stuck in the Dominican Republic or elsewhere can actually get information on what's likely to happen to them? And lastly, can I say to him, there are some countries where you have to apply for a business visa to go to a business meeting, up to £600 for India. And if they suddenly decide they're not issuing visas, can he encourage their High Commissioner and government to actually make that possible to be transferred to a future arrangement rather than just take the money and forget about it?
Can I thank my right honourable friend? I think you raised a number of very important points. We are liaising with tour operators, insurance companies, and of course airlines, and we will convey the message that he raises about making sure that their advice is transparent as possible. Obviously that needs to be done in real time, and I'll certainly consider further the flexibility that he suggested in relation to visas.
Alan Smith. Here.
Mr Speaker, thank you. I think now is a time where we should be seen to work together, and indeed work together, and thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement. I think now is the time for us also to issue party political point scoring. We in these benches support these changes, and we support this statement. I'd also like to record our appreciation and solidarity with the hard-working FCO staff worldwide who are doing a very tough job in very tough times, and they themselves have families and indeed respiratory conditions themselves in times. We put our support behind them. So I'd support this statement as far as it goes, but I would urge the Foreign Secretary, and perhaps it's a discussion that he needs to have with the Chancellor as well, I'm conscious there's a statement later on about that, but to go further. And his statement today didn't deal with the point about insurance at all. Now, for Scots and Brits abroad who are stuck and want to get back and are looking to find a way back, the biggest practical help we can do to them right now is to speak to the insurance companies, because their insurance is uppermost in their mind. Now, you'll be aware, colleagues will be aware of the statement this morning from Sir Charles Bean at the Office of Budgetary Responsibility. I quote, "You need the state to be there as the insurer of last resort against what is effectively an act of God. The state surely has a role. Big, early action is better than half-hearted action that's late." We couldn't agree more. The Chancellor is making a statement later on, but for our nationals who are overseas and want to get back, insurance is their biggest priority. Could I urge the Secretary of State to have a full discussion with the Chancellor on that point, and that the state needs to step in to get our people home?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman and particularly welcome the bipartisan tone that he took. Can I thank him for welcoming the statement, and can I particularly thank him for recognising and paying tribute to the consular staff and the wider FCO teams who, in very difficult circumstances, not least given the advice that we in government have given, are doing a tremendous job. He asked a number of questions, asked about insurance companies. Obviously, they take their lead, at least to some degree, from the travel advice changes. So one of the important things I think it is for the FCO to do is to give very clear and decisive travel advice, which is one of the reasons, or at least one of the benefits of the statement that we've made today. I certainly take on board his comments about working with the Secretary of State for Transport and the Chancellor to make sure we provide support to the sector, the airline sector, because, of course, not only is it an important sector in terms of jobs, but we also need them to help get the UK nationals home, because we want to, for the very reasons I made in my statement, allow them to do that through normal commercial means.
Tom Tugundar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This crisis is causing us to tear apart many aspects of the global system that we have grown used to over the last 20 or 30 years. The threat that it could pose to future scientific cooperation, to future defence against not just pandemics like this, but the poverty that has blighted so much of the world over recent generations is enormous. Can the Foreign Secretary assure me that as he is planning with his Foreign Office partners or with his Foreign Office staff to rescue and save so many people around the world, he is also looking to cooperate with others to make sure the international community works together to build a proper future based on a shared and prosperous globe?
Can I thank my right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee? He's absolutely right, both in terms of the measures we're taking, consular measures to support UK nationals who feel vulnerable or stranded overseas. I also agree with what he's saying about the need for an international approach to pandemics like this. We haven't seen anything like this before. That's why we're providing support to build up the capacity in some of those most vulnerable countries. We're doing that with a total envelope of up to £241 million of aid funding. We're working through the WHO, the Red Cross, UNICEF and other organisations. More generally, the Prime Minister spoke to counterparts in the G7 recently, yesterday in fact, and they agreed on the importance of a stronger, coordinated international approach, and that will include everything from the economic measures that we take through to the research and development to make sure that we have the collaboration to prevent further pandemics happening in the future.
Chris Brown.
Our consular staff are doing an amazing job, and many of them around the world are actually volunteers. They're not paid for their work either. So I hope the Foreign Secretary will pass on our gratitude on behalf of all of our constituents. But can I just tease out this issue about people returning home? Because as I understand the Foreign Secretary's advice, it is that if somebody is thinking of travelling abroad now, they should bear in mind that they may not be able to get back. But at the same time, he's saying that people shouldn't necessarily come back now. That seems to be inconsistent.
Well, can I first of all thank the honourable gentleman for what he said in relation to consular staff. We will pass it on, and it does matter that we can have cross-party support for the essential work that all of our public services are doing. He's asked about travel advice. Obviously, we're advising against all but essential travel globally. It is up to individuals who find themselves to make the individual judgment calls. It will depend on their personal circumstances. It will depend on the availability of commercial flights. And in the last resort, we've been able to provide the repatriation of flights. That is getting more difficult. So we will continue to provide the support, the advice, but ultimately some of those judgment calls will remain an individual decision to be made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to follow up what the Secretary of State was saying about ferries and the Department of Transport in relation to the UK. Two questions. Will the government please relax today competition law to allow discussion between the three cross-Solent ferry operators to build a resilience plan? They will be in breach of the law if they do not, and lives could depend on it if our ferry services fall over. Secondly, will the government support today the MCA to allow for people to sit in cars during ferry journeys in the UK to protect at-risk groups and for social distancing purpose? Thank you.
I thank honourable friend. He, as ever, raises very important and excellent practical points. They are mainly, I have to say, for the Secretary of State for Transport, but he is, I can reassure my honourable friend, he is talking to the ferry operators as well as the airliners and working together to make sure we get not just the clearest advice, but the most practical advice so that our constituents and indeed people travelling to the UK or from the UK can make the decisions that they need to make.
Just to help the House, I'm expecting to run this to around 2 o'clock. Alistair Carmichael.
The Foreign Secretary is absolutely right. Repatriation is a complex and costly business. But that surely is exactly why it's not something that should just be left to individuals, and there must be a leading role for government in this. Like many MPs, I've had representations this morning from constituents who were on holiday in Morocco who now find themselves stranded. The ambassador's Twitter account is telling them just to go to the airport with their passport and their ticket and see what they can fix up when they get there. We realise that the consular services are under stress, but surely this is a moment where they have to have every possible resource to provide the best possible information for our constituents.
Well, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman? I totally agree with him. We are providing the very best support, care, advice, and of course, when it comes to repatriations, we have secured, I think it was 200 that came back from China at the outset. We're also working in relation to the Braemar cruise ship to secure the return via Havana. I think it's the most intense diplomacy I've had with my Cuban opposite number in my time, but actually I have to say hugely welcome because they've been very cooperative. So we will do everything that we can. Of course, the point I would make to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the situation is very fluid. The decisions that are being made on the ground in countries like the one he suggested often happening very rapidly. And the challenge for airliners, but also for the FCO and the consular advice and support we provide, is just to make sure that we can respond not just as quickly as possible, but as effectively as possible.
Alicia Kearns.